It really kind of boils down to that question and curiosity around value, right? So the business has a goal, right? They want to make revenue, they want to expand market share. That's value to the business. But then there's value to the customer, right? What business goal are they trying to solve? Are they trying to, increase their own market share, increase their own customer satisfaction, increase their own revenue? And how does, a product kind of fit into an enterprise's ability to actually deliver the value that the customer expects?
All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Apex Podcast. And we are here today bringing back the Disruptor. I'm super excited to have John Coons back in the studio with us again today. John, how was your week?
My week has been a bit crazy as always. It's the end of the month, end of the quarter. So as we like to say in the company I work for, it's the most important quarter in the history of our company until next year or next quarter.
So for everybody that has, listened to the Disruptor episodes in the past, but maybe joining us for the first time, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit, and then we can dive into what our segment's going to be today.
Sure. So my real name is John Kuntz. I go by the Disruptor. I have a 37-year career in information technology. So as my friend Nicholas, who I will introduce in a minute, has coined, I've seen the waves of disruption over the years. And so what I like to talk about on these podcasts is sort of, you're either thus being disrupted or you are the disruptor. In other words, you are either a Airbnb or you're the hotel industry. You're either the taxi cab industry or you're the Ubers of the world. Or my favorite is you're either Blockbuster or you're Netflix. And so we are in a period of extreme digital disruption. And so this show tends to try to discuss those experiences and those stories from the field and try to empower people that are entrepreneurs to depth in their skills in design thinking, and anybody that potentially is a naysayer, maybe try to give it a second look. And so that's why today I've got one of my close colleagues and good friends, Nicholas, who used to work with me directly until he defected to a different part of our company. So Nicholas, why don't you introduce yourself for me, please?
Yeah. Well, Jan and John, thanks so much for having me today. My name is Nicholas Jayanty. I'm a principal UX researcher at one of the world's largest open source enterprise software companies. Prior to that, had the opportunity to work with John at another large technology company where we had the opportunity to help a lot of our customers kind of navigate digital transformation and kind of move a little bit more nimbly than larger organizations typically move. And given the context of whether you're the disruptor or the disrupted, it's important to kind of accelerate your time to market and get those things sorted out, so you don't end up in the same spot as the taxi company Blockbuster or the hotel industry. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, those of you that have probably heard us before, a little bit of background on how Nicholas and I got in sort of working together. So 5 years ago, actually, we bought a startup company in Austin, Texas, and it was a pretty sort of innovative, transformational company that helped with management of cloud and cloud workloads and those kind of things. And it was very comprehensive and sort of almost looked at cloud management as a supply chain, so sort of from cradle to grave, if you will. We went out and started selling it, and we got people excited, and we had and again, much of what we're going to talk about today is sort of how you pull some of these concepts into from the sort of the product management, the UX, the UI world into the sales world. And sort of how Nicholas and I got connected is we started trying to sell this stuff, and we got a lot of excitement. We got a lot of interest, and then all of a sudden, people would ask things like, "Well, how much does it cost? How long does it take?" And of course, we were trying to sell this sort of old-fashioned waterfall, the whole shoot and match kind of solution. And all of a sudden, our our sales sort of pipeline just stopped. The progression of deals just came to a screeching halt. And I got a bunch of people way smarter than me. And Nicholas was, hadn't met him yet, but some of his colleagues and cohorts. And we got in a room in Austin, and we started coming up with this idea of what if we started looking at this from a user-centric approach, a human sort of centric design approach. And we came up with this idea, and we started. I had no design background. I'm not a designer. I don't profess to be one. I'm just an old crusty consultant salesperson. And long story short, we did a few of these workshops. We took some approaches, and we realized we were onto something. But we also realized we needed help from an expert, and we pulled Nicholas in. So one of the things I want to sort of talk about is sort of the value of design thinking and the experience, or the experience disruptor. But before I get into that, I want to tell a little story, and I'm going to tell it visually if I can figure out how to work this. So I'm going to share my screen, see if this works. Awesome. So this is something I put together actually over a year ago, and it's sort of the theme that I want to sort of start to play out, Nicholas, with you, is sort of how do you get from empathy to transformation, and really a lot of this podcast that we gear to small businesses, startups, and entrepreneurs, and so why is this sort of really important now in today's world? And let's see here. So just bear with me, everybody. It's sort of want to take you through. Sort of what I put this together back in March of 2020, and it's like, what was my typical day during COVID, right? And so, like most of you, I probably, my diet was not so great, and I sort of put on some weight. And so every morning I would get up I'd weigh myself, and I had this scale that actually sends all my statistics to my phone. Of course, I was monitoring all my sleep statistics, with the help application. I get up, of course, I'm old, so I got to go find my glasses, and I'm searching the house for my Warby Parker glasses. I'll brew a cup of coffee or two or three or maybe four on my sort of cool looking Keurig coffee maker. I shave with this stuff I get every month from Dollar Shave Club. Might listen to some music or a podcast like this on Spotify. Get to work. I start to communicate with my team on things like Slack, work my network on LinkedIn. Of course, there was still are never ending video conferences. After a long day, I order some food from DoorDash. I get a bunch of packages delivered, right? I use this example because I have a dog, and I want to make sure my four-legged friends are taken care of. I might do a little binge watching on Netflix. And then after a long day of at that time sheltering in place, I fall asleep on my Casper mattress. And so you might go, well, so who cares? Why is this story relevant? And why now? And it really comes down to, because all of these are experience disruptors, right? We buy these products from people because they give us a good experience. They may or may not be any better or any even cheaper than other companies, but we buy them because of the experience. So this is actually one of the things that Nicholas taught me early on, right? This coffee pot is not an experience, but this is an experience, right? Starbucks creates an experience, and by doing that, they can get you, you'll still pay $5 for a dollar cup of coffee. So the moral of my story, and Nicholas, I want to then pick your brain on the value of design, is this, it's no longer a distinction. And this is a quote from a VP at IBM. There's no longer any real distinction between organization strategy and their design. In other words, the best experience that anyone anywhere has is the one they had last. So if you're not working on providing a great experience, and oh, by the way, that's not just building your product and your services. It's providing an excellent sales experience. And so that's sort of the story that I came to, and I want to sort of unpack a little bit and sort of talk about the value of design, and especially applying it to um, to the eventually to the sort of design in general and the sales experience in a little more detail. So, Nicholas, I think you helped me with a lot of those thoughts. So I sort of plagiarized them. But I mean, tell us about what this whole notion and how you sort of came about this getting into this design world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I came to the design practice of design actually from a independent film background. Prior to prior to working in IT, I was producing independent films, both documentary and narrative. Had some films, do the festival circuit, world premiere at Sundance, South by Southwest, Seattle International Film Festival. Got some, New York Times critical acclaim. Um, and it was really interesting because, when I reflect back on it as an independent producer, my end user is a director, right? I'm there to support their vision. I'm there to help remove blockers. I'm there to help them get the right resources they need to communicate that vision, whether that's people, money, time, etc. But what's interesting is that the directors in the independent film space that I had the opportunity to work with thought very little about their audience. They very much more are taking more of an inside out point of view where I'm an artist. I have this vision that I want to express. I'm an chore, meaning I'm the only one qualified to express that vision because of my unique lived experience. And I feel like the story is really important. And so I'm going to invite, 300 people to sit in a theater in the dark next to each other and not talk because the story I have to tell is so important. Um, and it's kind of interesting when you start to apply that kind of point of view to technology. A lot of times, a lot of these companies, and one of the reasons that I started my design career at the United States Geological Survey and then moved on to IBM, because one of the things that IBM was doing by investing, they invested $100 million in bringing human-centered design to the core of their organization, is because they realized that there's a lot of really, great visionaries that are creating technology looking for a problem to solve, right? And so design was brought into IBM really to help reframe that. Say, what are the unmet needs out there? What do our customers need? What are the things that they're struggling with? And how do we develop technology to actually meet that need as opposed to develop technology and then look for a problem to solve? So it's kind of inverting that point of view from an inside out point of view to an outside in point of view. And so as a user experience practitioner and researcher, a lot of the work that I do before we even get into the tactical aspects of it is just helping people reframe how they think about value, right? Value is co-created. Like John was saying, um, you know, uh, the coffee pot, right? That coffee pot example. The value isn't created just by the coffee pot object. The value is actually realized when I take that sip of coffee in the morning. It's beautiful outside. Maybe I'm reading a paper. Maybe I'm sitting with my partner and we're enjoying that moment together. And that's where the value of that coffee pot actually gets manifested. So it's important for us to think that of value in the sense that it doesn't exist until a person picks up that coffee pot, uses it, and sips the outcome of that object.
Cool. So tell me a little bit. I mean, again, we met because we each had a need. You, as a design research, were looking for like real live, client external data, and I was trying to figure out how to sell more stuff. And so tell me a little bit about like how you work design in sort of the, I'll call it the research mode that like I said, was really what we hired you to do, and I hijacked you to go actually out and talk to
You might
customers and try to help me sell stuff.
you might have smelled my former producing hat. Definitely love to sell stuff. Um, but going back, it really kind of boils down to kind of that question and curiosity around value, right? So the business has a goal, right? They want to make revenue, they want to expand market share. That's value to the business. But then there's value to the customer, right? What business goal are they trying to solve? Are they trying to, increase their own market share, increase their own customer satisfaction, increase their own revenue? And how does, a product kind of fit into an enterprise's ability to actually deliver the value that the customer expects? But beyond that, right, a lot of times in the enterprise context, the customer, the person that's purchasing the software or the product, isn't the end user. And value is subjective, right? What's valuable to a VP of information technology or information technology operations may not be valuable to the developer or the sys administrator that's trying to use the tool. And so being able to collaborate with John gave us kind of real world context in terms of what value looks like and how our end users actually articulate value in their own words, which is a very powerful thing. When someone can sit down and write a value proposition of what would be valuable to them in their role, you're getting kind of the purest essence of like what a value prop could look like for the specific end user that's going to have their hands on the software. And let me pause. There's some background noise. I don't know if y'all can catch that.
While
Got
we're
to
doing
love
that,
Oakland.
you know,
Yeah, I'll start again. So, did we freeze?
No, you're good. We can still hear you. Sometimes the video may trickle in and out.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
you're good.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yep, we can hear. Oh. Can you hear us, Nick?
How you guys doing? Can you see me?
Good.
On y'all's end
Yep.
of things, it's a little bit paused. Okay, we're back. Okay. Where did it start to break up?
We're sort of just talking about the value, and I was actually about to jump in about the whole idea of inside out versus outside in value. And you were sort of talking about that, the value to the business and the value to, if you will, the buyer or the customer.
And then ultimately the value to the end user. So,
Yes.
in our collaboration, it was nice to kind of sit shotgun and help these people articulate what value looks like in their own language. Yeah.
So Nicholas, I think, expound on that a little bit. When, what one of the things I thought I learned, well, two things. One is I was surprised how, in when we started this sort of approach, that so much of what I thought is really this whole idea of co-creation and value and design thinking sort of, it's almost like there was this wall between the product management, the developers, sorry, it's the everybody sort of in the back office, if you will, and then all of a sudden we had this wall, and then everything was then sort of pushed over to the front office, if you will, the people out knocking on doors, shaking trees, trying to sell stuff, and we were still trying to sell like it was 1985. And I don't know, and from as a not as a you have a sales mentality, but you were not paid to be a selling person. So give us your perspective on what you sort of, I mean, does that make sense? What did you see from, I said, from your view or your world when you sort of started seeing what we were trying to do, both and on the sales side of the house?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, right, your sales team's communicating a value proposition, and they're communicating why that value proposition works for the context of the customer.
Mhm.
And as a user experience team, our responsibility is to deliver that value, right? So we've made all these promises, we've set all these expectations. Now the product actually has to live up to those promises. So having firsthand knowledge in terms of the customer's context, the value that they expect, and then seeing how being in the room with the customer and seeing what they needed, seeing how that kind of showed up in some of the product management kind of apparatus, from like ticketing systems to requirements. A lot of the requirements were very much kind of sanitized from the customer context. And there's a balance there, right? Where in an offerings business, you're trying to standardize as much as possible, meaning I don't want to do a bunch of custom solutions. I want everything to be standardized. So you are kind of walking that line between understanding customers' needs and then figuring out what to prioritize in your product roadmap. But you want to find those patterns across customers. And if you can find that same need across 5 to 6 customers versus a one-off need for a specific customer, you're going to handle that differently. You're going to prioritize things differently. And as a researcher, our job is to kind of identify what are those patterns across customers and how do we help our product manager and our engineering counterparts understand those patterns so that they can make, prioritization decisions on what's going to come out each quarter. So a lot of that uh, is kind of the outside in point of view, but then there's the inside out point of view that you got to navigate, right? Technical debt, shortcuts that were made to get the product to market, all of the things that the product management and the engineering organization are already sensitive about. Perhaps you have executive, vision kind of in entering the product development conversation as well, saying like, I think the market's going here. I read this analyst report and I have a strong hypothesis. And so how do you balance kind of that strong top down kind of influence, kind of hijacking your roadmap? How do you balance customers hijacking your roadmap? And how do you kind of triangulate all of these different inputs and outputs to make sure that what's coming out each quarter is what your customers are needing or what your potential new prospects are needing in order to either deliver the value of what you sold or close new deals?
Excellent. So I want to shift gears a little bit to the world that I spend on my sort of volunteer time, which is I try to work with a lot of entrepreneurs and startups and sort of, especially in the Midwest a little bit. And anyway, one of the things in the startup world is about 90% of startups fail, right? And they typically fail because of one of the top three is poor market fit. And to me, there's this, and in the Midwest, and more importantly, unlike the coasts, where startups sort of find a need and fill it, in the Midwest, people come up with a good idea and then go try to sell it. And I don't know if there's probably reasons for that, but it's just sort of what I've observed. And so what I keep trying to tell, and I'd love your perspective, like, and advice to some of these smaller companies. We have a lot of those that listen to this podcast, is like, you've got good ideas, but at the end of the day, will anybody actually buy it? Right. And so I
Yeah.
think that applying some of these, and we'll go into some of the stuff we used to do or we've been doing, but I think, will anybody actually buy your product or service? And how design thinking might help them sort of bring those two answers together, if you will.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I think that the same principles, apply if you're AWS or if you are a smaller group. And I think the CEO of Amazon Web Service said this. His name's Andy Jassy. He said, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but every company wants two things: one, to try as many experiments as possible, and two, to suffer as little collateral damage from the experiments that fail. Right? So how do I, it's the whole, startup mentality of fail early and often, right? And I'd like to reframe that and say learn early and often.
Mm.
If you're not being clear about what you want to learn from whatever you put into the market, even if it's a kind of even a splash page, right? Just kind of seeing like who might be even interested in that if you're like borrowing from like kind of the lean startup methodology where you're just doing the splash page and connecting emails, right? How do you burn through those experiences as quickly as possible to figure out what that product market fit is before you invest in engineering? One of the beautiful things about having a robust design capability is you can test ideas in a clickable format and not spend $1 on code. One of the IEEE had this great article as to like why software fails, and one of the main reasons that software fails is bad requirements. And bad requirements, what you can interpret that to mean a lot of different things, but one of the worst requirements is making a product that nobody wants. Um,
Hmm.
so how do you test these ideas? Test a lot of them, and then spend that money smarter. I mean, as a startup, every misstep will set you in a rough spot. In my own experience before from the film space, we brought a startup mentality to the business work that we were doing, right? We were like, let's learn from startup culture and apply this to an entertainment startup. And, the first business that I launched was, we had this idea that we had this offering that people would want. And there were so many reasons that they didn't want it. And if we had just kind of set up a website and just kind of like marketed kind of the offering and just given it like 3 months and kind of been really disciplined with ourselves and say, okay, if we don't make $1 in 3 months, we're going to kill this. We would have saved like 4 years of our lives and probably a lot of money that we kind of kept pumping into this effort. So yeah, I think the opportunity to kind of learn fast and learn quickly, and leverage kind of lightweight capabilities to figure out what that product market fit is before you invest more heavily. It's one of the superpowers of having design capability within your organization, and just enables kind of those larger goals for really creative startup founders, which is what are those things I want to try.
Hey, so I'm gonna pop in here real quick. So what fat you something about the way that you just phrased that last little bit of the explanation there. You said lightweight capabilities, right? And I coming from the startup world, and for those of you that this is the first time, kind of listening to why I'm even here, outside of the fact that this is currently on kind of the Apex's segment. But me and John met when I was initially coming up with the idea for what would then become Apex Communications Network, right? Where we use a lot of these tactics that you and John are going to continue to explain throughout this episode to help people more accurately identify problem statements online, and then use that to guide their SEO strategy and a lot of their analytics strategies. And essentially, what I didn't realize we were doing is helping them launch new revenue streams or new products or develop services to offer to their customers. So for a long time, and this is kind of like I'm hoping that there's going to be a lot of other startup owners that listen to this. For a long time, I thought that beta testing something or getting an MVP out, and MVP for those of you that's minimally viable product, right? And getting out these things had to be, a month of research and a whole bunch of thought that goes into it, and putting all of these things out. And then I started to realize that, an example of a lightweight version of what you could use to really connect with your customer, we put out a single clip over COVID. And all it was a step by step of me clicking through a Facebook FAQ on how to know whether or not your website had a Facebook pixel installed on it. And so, for those of you that are not familiar with that space, a Facebook pixel basically allows you to connect your Google Analytics to your Facebook, so that you can see like where those users cross over, and it kind of mixes data together so you can retarget for ads and all of this other stuff. But it's something that was extremely functional and super useful. But a lot of businesses that I was around in the Midwest, like, we thought that maybe they would want help with a Facebook pixel, but we weren't sure. Right. So we were going to develop this service to help people. And so I was like, you know what? Let's just put out a post and just educate people on how to check and see if they have one, and the reasons why they should have one. And if they don't, to ask their agency why they don't have one. And we just put out this little clip, and it just showed people how to audit it. And we ended up getting 5 or 6 responses from people that said, hey, I saw this video. I ended up asking my agency about it. I have no idea why we don't have one. This is something, we sell products on Facebook and all this other stuff. And it was kind of that little confirmation that was enough for us to say, hey, okay, maybe we focus on this a little bit. We got 6 responses from people in our area that immediately recognized the need. Whereas what you guys are saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you go back and try to just develop that whole Facebook service, we would have spent a month maybe figuring something out and then put it out and had absolutely nobody respond to it. Whereas the way that happened is we put out a post, you get responses, and then develop the service after you actually engage with the customer. That's kind of the landscape as it is. And it's beautiful because like you have these lightweight capabilities with the internet to be able to interact with users at a large scale. Whereas previously, I think John said, you're selling like it's 1985. You couldn't do that in 1985. But it was a lot more difficult to reach that many users that quickly.
Well, and things were a lot slower, right? I mean, the pace of change over the last 30 years has just exponentially gone. It's faster and more disruptive. I mean, and in all my years, this last few years, the amount of change and the amount of disruption by businesses coming in and just upsetting thing, and a lot of it is that the technology has equalized people, right? So the barriers of entry are down. But the reason I bring that up is because you don't have. I've seen a lot of companies that they want to spend a lot of time and a lot of money trying to get something that they think is perfect before they go out. And unfortunately, by the time they do that, in many cases, the reason the requirements are no good, Nicholas, is because they've changed. They might have been they might have been appropriate 6 months ago or a year ago, but if you take 18 months to deploy something, the odds are that the business's requirements, the user's requirements are going to change just because the world is moving so fast.
Yeah,
So,
and going back to the quote that you flashed earlier, right? And the last best experience that anyone has is the experience they expect everywhere.
yeah. So that actually takes me into my sort of next piece of this that I want to talk about. And you alluded to it. And I'm going to share my screen in a second. But, I want to get into this idea. And I think, Jan, you alluded to it, right? What you were doing was you were sort of collaborating, co-creating with your potential customers. And so one of the things that's sort of this process, and some of the one of the takeaways I want to give to the audience is I want to share this sort of 5-step process that Nicholas and I have sort of I sort of started, and Nicholas helped me sort of perfect, so to speak. And I think it's very relevant to sort of this discussion especially for entrepreneurs and others. And so, and then what Nicholas I want to do is I want to get you to sort of deep dive into some of this. So, of course, you've seen this chart before. I've cleaned it up a little. I've changed a little bit, but I want to start with the concept of the double diamond, right? And I want you to get your perspective on this sort of diverge, converge, diverge. This is something I've actually started using because I think you probably showed it to me, and then we'll go into these sort of 5 steps after that. Is that making sense?
Yeah. I think what is it? Pivotal comes out of the double diamond, right? That comes out of the
I don't know
pivotal.
where it came from. I just took it from somebody, maybe you, and have sort of enhanced it and used it in my work.
Yeah, and you'll see this model, kind of tweaked for across the industry. I think like IDEO has a flavor of this. IBM has its infinite loop flavor of this, and I think when I look at this, right, there's it's really helpful when you're dealing with a very diverse and empowered team, right? Where you have a lot of strong opinions and a lot of strong expertise. How do you get as much out of that group that you're working with in the time by letting them diverge and work independently? And then when you're converging, right, you're bringing that back together, and that's about prioritization. And so as you kind of move through this kind of this process, right, you're continuously working together, separating, and then coming back together. And it ultimately allows you to kind of grok where you're at in the process and perhaps what might be a good next step, and these steps I would say are not linear, right? I think they're represented linearly, but you can get
Yeah.
dropped in at any point of this diamond and start there. So you could start with a prototype, put it in front of your user base, just like Jan did, right? He's like, we weren't sure if this service was going to work, so we made something, we put it out there, we're going to make to learn. We're going to put this artifact in the world. We're going to provoke a group of people to respond to it by this thing. And then we'll kind of land back on that observe and define stage. Now that we have a better understanding, there might be some interest. We're observing that people are responding. Now, how do we kind of refine that and define kind of what that offering might be? So what that could look like, a follow-up step to those 6 respondents is maybe let's set 6 conversations up, like 30-minute to an hour-long interview, and talk to them about what their unmet needs are around this. Perhaps that might expose kind of what their unmet needs are. Perhaps it might give you some other feature opportunities or additional requirements just by talking to them. Sometimes you can invite them to kind of say, show me how you might use this data. Like, what decisions are you making with the information that how do I use this Facebook pixel data? What questions am I asking the data? And by learning that, now you can kind of further define the problem statement that you actually want to solve for these customers. Because, and even just the response is like, there's interest, right? But now I've got to really kind of dig down into that interest and figure out, well, what's that pain point? Like, what's the why? Why are these people interested? What value does understanding the relationship between Facebook and Google Analytics and that kind of visibility, what value does that provide my business? And then by understanding that value that you're providing to those potential customers, now you can kind of shape that offering a little bit more thoughtfully to kind of reach that product market fit that John's describing.
And so what we ended up doing, and what I'm sort of want to work with me here a little bit. I'm going to sort of step through these 5 phases, if we would, that we sort of stumbled upon. Now, these are, as Nicholas said, you can start anywhere in sort of this loop. But what we as salespeople found is like the only way somebody buys something is if they have a problem they're trying to fix, right? So there's some pain or there's something they need, right? Otherwise, it's a nice to have, and nobody's going to take the time, especially if you're selling something that is fairly expensive. So the idea is we started with sort of at the end with this idea of a problem. What's the problem the client? So my advice to entrepreneurs is, what is the problem that your product or service sells, right? Or is trying to solve, excuse me. And then the first step is just what we said is, understanding your stakeholders or personas. So give me your perspective, Nicholas, on sort of how, you're the one that really got me in depth of understanding the value of personas as mapping personas.
Oh wow. So personas. So how would I say this? Not all personas that you'll encounter in the world are created with the same rigor. A lot, if the definition I use for a persona is it's a qualitative data model that captures what users' kind of key goals are, what their pain points are, what their behaviors are, and what their unmet needs are. And you can create those personas um, in a number of ways. Ideally, primary research is your primary method of data collection when you're collecting kind of the information that's going to inform that model. And you can use these qualitative data models or these personas in a number of ways. In the software space, we'll use it right when we're kicking off a new feature to figure out, who is the potential end user of this feature, what value do they expect from this feature, are we when we go out to test, in this and prototype, are we recruiting the right people that are representative of the persona to make sure that we are testing the solution with the right group? We can use our personas to help anchor people in a user experience. So, for example, when you think about the behaviors of a developer, right? There are behaviors that are developed. There are developers that are developing in the cloud. There are developers that are developing locally, right? There are developers that are using a command line interface, and then there are developers that are using a graphic user interface. So by having that segmentation across your different user group and having two kind of personas to represent those different behavioral characteristics, now you've got more experiences that can be created. What's the command line experience for Jim, the 50-year-old sysadmin who's been programming in a data center, who's working in a data center or in a NOC his entire life, and he just loves the command line, doesn't care about GUIs, versus like, Jane, who's like a 23-year-old developer, just wants to write app code, doesn't even want to open up the command line, wants all that stuff to be handled for her, and she just wants to click a few buttons to get an environment that she needs so she can code. You've got two kind of great opportunity spaces just by understanding that segmentation. Another place that I've seen personas be used in a really interesting way is when you start to think about ability. People with varying abilities, and you can think about that across a spectrum, right? There are people that are permanently living with a disability. For example, someone who, is doesn't live with the ability to see, versus somebody who is situationally unable to see because they just went to the doctor, right? And just got their eyes dilated. So when you think about those personas in the extreme and you come up with that experience for them by deeply understanding this person's ability, it opens up kind of the aperture of the types of experiences that you can use to differentiate, right? So by deeply understanding some of what we call the extreme users, you start to get at new spaces and new opportunities for product innovation as well. So you can use personas in a lot of different ways.
Excellent. Well, and one of the things is we take this over to the design or the sales side is that we can getting a feedback. We
I think you might be getting it from the. Oh wow, I'm getting feedback too. Hold on
There
one
we
sec.
go. I think it was Nicholas going on mute helped.
We good there?
All right.
Cool, beautiful.
Yeah. All right. So, Nicholas, one of the things I was thinking is also what I've noticed in this world. Like, so you got a lot of great points, and now that we take that over into some like a seller or a founder trying to sell their product or service, and we see a lot of work done around buying personas. But what I didn't see was a lot of work on the people that are actually going to use the problem persona, if you will, the person that has the problem. And so that sort of takes me into step two, which is which is one of my favorites, is the empathy mapping. And I actually took Jan through an empathy mapping exercise early on in his journey. So, you know, um, tell us about empathy mapping from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love to use empathy maps in a couple different ways. I think one of the best ways I've seen empathy maps employed is when you have a group of different stakeholders that perhaps are saying maybe, yes, this is our user, but perhaps they think about that user a little differently. So the first thing it does is it just gets all the assumptions about who you're serving on the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives you a place to document them. It gives you an opportunity to spot the tension within the team. It also gives you an opportunity to reveal gaps in what you don't know about your user. And so you can use an empathy map as a way to kind of build your research hypothesis and then also inform your research planning as you kind of more deep in your understanding of your users.
And
Another
then
way I've seen. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, then at the end of the day, right, you're you're stepping in the shoes of your users or your the people you're selling to, and you're
Yeah,
trying to understand what they say, what they feel, what they do, and
yeah,
what they think.
yeah. And we were really lucky because instead of us kind of proxying and imagining what these end users are saying, doing, thinking, and feeling, we actually would do this activity with the end user where they would populate it themselves. They're like, this is what I do. This is what I do. So it removes all the speculation and conjecture. One of the keys of design thinking and enterprise design thinking is that our users align us with reality. Um, and when you're kind of in the office and you're not getting out of the building and you're not talking to your end users, we get a lot of head trash, as I think John has used the word. Which is a lot of assumptive thinking. A lot of energy gets invested in like negotiating with your teammates as opposed to bringing some data to the conversation that is going to remove all that kind of conflict and immediately give everyone kind of a direction to go in. That's the other thing that a lot of the value that you get from talking to your users is it prevents burnout, right? Like if you have a strong team with strong opinions and they're investing an hour to 3 hours to 4 hours a week negotiating how one thing should look, you're creating churn, right? You're not necessarily empowering those people to be as effective as possible, because instead of understanding their users and taking those 4 hours and talking to some customers, they're spending 4 hours arguing or debating or negotiating. So that's kind of a litmus test actually for those of you out there, that if you notice yourself in a meeting multiple times having the same conversation, that's probably a good opportunity to get out of the building and go talk to your end users and save your team some time.
Well, one of the things we learned was Nicholas, put your mute on for a sec. Yeah. One of the things we learned was that when we got a group of people in the room, everybody knows something about the personas or the people that we're working on, but they learned a ton about each other, right? And they really were all of a sudden realizing, and this, I think COVID brought this out. People really started to empathize with the people they were working with, and they really started to realize how they sort of all were interconnected in essentially running the business, so to speak.
Which, to go back to what you were talking about, which is like, how does empathy become transformation,
Right.
right? That's the catalyst, that empathy for one another, where you start to see how one action that someone you don't even talk to or is not in the same department as you, they take, and that impacts you downstream. A lot of times there's no visibility into how the choices that you're making impact other people within your organization. I've been in workshops where, the front of the house and the back of the house of this banking organization, they were so upset with each other because the back of the house needed this one piece of information and the front of the house continued to not provide it to them. So this back of the house employee was just trapped, and it didn't come out until they were in the same room that the back of the house and the front of the house people realized that the field that the back of the house person needed populated wasn't even in the front of the house person's interface. They didn't even know. And there was just like animosity between these two departments. And it was just this one field that just wasn't showing up in this one interface that was just like hamstringing an entire department. And that was nobody's fault. That was bad user experience, right? That's nobody's fault. But bringing these people together in the room, they're like, why? Well, you're so frustrated. They wouldn't even talk to each other at the beginning of the session. There was so much tension. And then as they started to understand what the data that matters, one of the people in the front of the house clicked and they're like, oh, wait, this sounds like this is really critical to like you all being able to do these parts. And like one of my reasons that I'm frustrated with you all is because it takes so long to get this task accomplished. But what I'm hearing you say is we're not actually getting you the information you need. And the person was like, well, yeah. And he's like, well, that's interesting because our interface actually doesn't even ask for that information. So I didn't even know that you needed it. And they both looked at each other and like I swear they wanted a hug. Like, because they were like, oh my goodness, like we've had all this tension, like, and now we realize that like this is a technology problem, not a people problem. But it wouldn't have happened until they kind of deep dived into one another's empathy maps and deep dived into what each other were doing, and even like kind of a little bit more important, like what's the data that matters to each of these different people, and how do we make sure that that information is exchanged in the way that everybody needs to find it.
That jump in?
Yeah.
All right. So I've been like super, super obsessed recently with the right and the left hemispheres of the brain and why they're separated by the corpus callosum, right? So for those of you that like, I'm going to get a little bit anatomy here to just kind of set the stage. But so we have this thing called the corpus callosum or corpus callosum running through the right and left hemispheres of our brain. And it's basically its entire job is to prevent electrical signals from crossing over, right? Because if they start to do that and everything starts to spark all at once, it's called epilepsy, right? Like it's your brain is having a seizure, everything's, connected all at one time and it just provides information overload. But what you're describing, what I think is really cool about as you guys are walking through this process, and we're talking about empathy to transformation, right? There's actually a lot of like neurochemical triggers that you guys are triggering in people that will bond them to make future innovation possible. Because like you said at the end of that, like I swear to God, they wanted to hug, right? In that moment, they're getting such a large rush of serotonin and oxytocin and dopamine, right? That they're just in this place where they now feel bonded to this person, right? So they're now in the future are going to communicate. You've not only identified a problem, you've destroyed a communication barrier, which I think is, that's really part of where the real value comes in. So what's fascinating about the way that you guys, this double diamond approach is in the left part of our brain, we really anchor things down, right? Like a good example is like for most people, they're right-handed. So the left part of your brain guides the right hand, and that's like you're grasping, right? So you're picking things up. That's a tangible idea. That's something that you have a hold of. Whereas the right brain kind of has this, its job is to perceive everything else. Like I'm talking to you guys right now, so I'm very focused on this conversation. That's my left brain kind of guiding my perception here. But my right brain is telling me that I know that, there's other things going on in my apartment. If I heard a door click, I would turn, right? But that's not the immediate part of my perception. But the way that the diamond forces you to go is that it forces people into that right brain thought where it's like, okay, what are all of the other possibilities of things that could potentially be causing this to be disrupted? And let's take it and then narrow it down into something where we can actually grasp something. And then, like you said, that light bulb moment happens, but it only happens when you get into a right brain space where the right brain is really good at pattern recognition. And it'll recognize a pattern. And then as the conversation continues, that pattern will start to get more refined, things will start to happen. And then somewhere along that continuum, there's a ding, right? And then it transitions over into this left brain thought process that now fills in all the details and understands the process and can actually tangibly grasp something like that problem, right? But that wouldn't happen if you didn't get those two people into the room at the same time and create that conversation or that space. I always talk about creating creative space to allow people to have those conversations. So like doing that, I'm just like fascinated with all of the actual biological triggers that you guys are hitting throughout this process. That's what I've been really focused on learning a lot about recently. So I just had to throw that in there for all of my RNs and science people that listen to the Apex.
That's the ICU nurse coming out of you. So
Yeah.
so we've done this sort of first two first two pieces where we started with a sort of specific set and identified sort of a problem, and or we then started diverging, understanding who's involved and who was impacted by those problems, and then we continue to diverge by trying to actually empathize with them. The next sort of phase of this is to start to converge, which is really to start to identify the so now that we've walked in the shoes of those personas, we now can sort of identify where the opportunity is for improvement. So it's sort of like, how do I transform them, or how do I help them navigate these seas of these disruptive seas? And then we'll, the next sort of 3 and 4 sort of go together. Once we diverge into like what where their opportunities are, then we converge out and try to figure out where our product and solution will help them solve those, or fix or address those opportunities. So sort of, I want to sort of Nicholas, give us your perspective on sort of that next phase, right? Once we've worked and we sort of lived the world, we start to now try to, from a sales perspective, I'm now trying to identify things that the unmet needs of the client or the prospect with my product or service.
Well, I think it's great. I think it's always good to design with the end in mind, right? And I think in the context of some of the work that John and I were doing is like we knew we needed a phased approach. We knew we needed to be able to deliver value within 90 days. Like that was what we were looking for. Is like, where do we start? We've got all these opportunities now. We've bubbled these all up. We have some hypotheses on where to start based on what working, in this context many times. But now, we're seeing if the customer is going to arrive at some of the same conclusions that we've kind of are already hypothesizing about. So if the goal is to kind of get to this 90-day or proof of value or minimum viable product, and you've gone through the activity of understanding the empathy map and where those pain points are, now you need to get some prioritization, right? So once you kind of have articulated some of the pain points, we'd work with our customers to kind of articulate value propositions or user-centered statements of intent with a measurable outcome that's compelling and differentiating. We call them hills in enterprise design thinking. And we have those participants of these workshops actually articulate what value and success looks like to them in their own words. So we'll go through this activity where they'll craft as many kind of value statements to this particular user as possible. And then we prioritize it, right? And we prioritize it by impact to that end user and feasibility of the solution, meaning is what do we have on the truck aligned with what the customer's seeking in that priority. And so the feasibility of us being able to deliver it and the prioritization of that value by the customer helps find kind of where that Venn diagram of success looks like and gives us that kind of starting point. So, from 3 to 4 to 5, right? 5 is the kind of the output of kind of seeing that Venn diagram, and then you can figure out what you're going to do first, second, third. But that prioritization happens in step 3, and then that mapping happens in step 4.
And if you plot those two, right? So if you hit the what's important to the client and what's available to us as our product and service, you will again create a magic quadrant in Gartner's perspective.
Which helps you prioritize. It's like, okay, everything in the top right corner, let's do that first.
Right. High priority, high value, or high capability, high value to the client.
And what's cool about this is that it's emergent, right? It's not like a group of people leaving the room and coming back and telling you. Everybody that's participating can now see it happen in front of them. So they know that like the only bias that's being filtered into this process is the bias of the people in the room. So that emergent kind of moment is very much an aha for everybody involved because they're like, cool, it gets real clear, real fast.
And like one thing I want to just add before we move into the next section here is I want to anchor that down and like how powerful that moment of realization is for the group for the future of the way they approach problem solving. Like the human brain, I mean, they talk about all the time training military units before they go overseas, right? And there's a reason why they put them in high stressful situations and put them into, kill houses, as they call them, to learn how to clear houses and get timing and all this other stuff, and put pressure so that when they go out into the field and they actually encounter pressure, the brain has already encountered pressure similar to it and is able to cope with it easier, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So when you get that person, even if it's just one time they experience that light bulb, they're forever going to understand that the only biases that are present are the ones that are in the room. And to get out of that thinking and escape kind of the box, go out into the unknown, into chaos, you can grab the different things that are out there and bring it back down into order. But until they go through that experience at least one time, they may not ever have that realization. But once that happens, it is valuable all the way across the span of the organization for the existence of that employee that
Well,
experienced that workshop.
it's really interesting, because a lot of people don't work this way. We're conditioned in like a capitalist kind of society that there's one person who does everything and the team is often obfuscated. Like it's called the great man theory of history, right? Where there's one founder or one visionary. And in all of these contexts that John and I have worked in, it's very much a team collaboration. There's no ownership assigned to the ideas that come out of this workshop. It's owned by the group, which is very collective. One of the things that we invite people to do in order to keep the space collaborative and inclusive is we invite people to ideate silently first, which kind of neutralizes the loudest voice in the room because we're bringing in people that are kind of the intern as well as the executive, and we need them all to work together. So, what are different things from a facilitation standpoint can we inject into this room uh, to create a safe space to allow people the safety to fail, to come up with that wild idea? We borrow some practice from improv, like yes and is something that we'll do a lot, where we don't discourage ideas that perhaps are unfeasible. We're like, yeah, let's play that out, let's play that story. So that space, this space that you're socializing in, is very much a possibility space. It's a yes space. And so our role as facilitators is to create that level of comfort amongst the participants and facilitators to help them get there, right? That ideation phase, if you're thinking, if you're not feeling comfortable and confident, the ideas that people are gonna put out are not gonna be as creative as if they're in a great headspace. There's a study that Harvard University did on happiness in their happiness laboratory, and it was with physicians. And what they did was they had their control group, and it was a group of doctors. And then the test group was a group of doctors that got a piece of chocolate before they went and saw their patient. And so they baselined the doctors that didn't get the piece of chocolate in terms of their accuracy of diagnosis. Then they looked at the group that was given a piece of chocolate and looked at the accuracy of their diagnoses, and they saw like an exponentially better accuracy in the diagnoses that the doctors that were given a piece of chocolate before they saw the patient were than the control group. And what they realized is that when people are in a good place and feeling safe and confident and happy, their creativity increases exponentially. You're going to get a better outcome and a better output from them if that space is maintained and curated, the right dynamic. So the psychosocial piece of this, Jan, is very relevant, and it's not something that John and I really index on very much when we're talking about it from a business standpoint, but on a human-centered standpoint, and like how do you get people to engage in this new way of working and not detract and participate. Very much happens in how you set these introductions up, how you set these activities up, and the space that you curate to invite people into this collaborative environment.
Oh yeah, and that's the spot that I'm like the most fascinated with right now is okay, what types of activities bring people in. I was in an improv group in college, and it's super interesting the way that you kind of gamify that ideation process using improv, because games, we understand how to play games if we're properly socialized children at a very young age. It's basically, you're a 3, 4, 5 year old, and you start the process off, and you're just mimicking, right? And then there's this transition period, and it might be a little bit earlier than that. I'm sure somebody will comment on this to the stages, but you start out with like mimicking what the rules are, and you don't even really understand the rules. But as long as everybody agrees that the rules are the rules, you can run around in circles and have a great time, right? But then you get to this point where it's like, why are the rules the rules? And but then when you gamify something, it takes people back to that childhood mentality where it's, hey, as long as we all agree that this is, what it is, and we respect that, it automatically becomes a safe space because it's so deeply ingrained in how we operate as people. That's how we learn to navigate the world at a really early age. Is basically like, okay, I have empathy for this person because they're playing tag. If I break the rules, that means that I'm disrespecting them, and all of this other kind of stuff. But it kind of gives this parameter set within which to operate, which makes people comfortable, and then you just allow them to kind of continue a story and improv stuff. And holy, I can't even imagine the types of beautiful answers that come out of a structure like that. That's super, super interesting.
Well, even play has rules, right? That's one of the reasons that play works, is because everyone follows this set of rules, and you've created these constraints, and those constraints aren't limiting, they're freeing in a lot of ways, because there's certain things you can't do, but working within those constraints often leads to stuff that you never expected.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap this segment up, or this piece up, and then last thing of this piece of this is, thanks, Nicholas, is we obviously we've started as sort of as at a convergent point. We've diverged, we've now converged, and we sort of now diverged again because we've got all these ideas and all these capabilities, and we've matched them up and we've prioritized them. Now, as an entrepreneur, and even as a customer, you can't implement everything at once, especially in something that's new and transformational that nobody's really ever done before. So we came up with this idea of developing this, what I call the agile-based roadmap, or the agile-based strategic plan, to help identify those value props. So the idea is all those things that are really important to the customer and match our immediate capability, so they end up in the top left-hand corner, right-hand corner, are what we want to focus on. So I love this concept in design thinking, and I think, Nicholas, if you'd expound upon this whole idea of developing the cake roadmap, right? The cupcake, the birthday cake, the wedding cake.
Yeah, absolutely, John. So a lot of times we'll hear the word MVP, minimum viable product, and I think what this activity does is it reframes what the minimum viable product is, to think of it more as the minimum delightful experience, right? Because the minimum viable product is often driven by what's on the truck, what's feasible today, while the minimum delightful experience is what's the most um, the smallest piece of value that we can deliver to the user right now, right? So when we talk about the kind of cake roadmap, right, what's that cupcake, right? If the big vision for the whole business is this, right, and that's the wedding cake, the whole shebang, it's a little fuzzy, maybe we don't quite understand what this wedding cake looks like, maybe we're not sure how many candles, how many layers, if it's sprinkles or fondant, icing, we're not really sure, but we know we have kind of a general sense. But the famous, how do you eat an elephant, is one bite at a time. It's like, well, what's that minimum cupcake that still has that yummy taste of that wedding cake, but small enough and yummy enough that if we just give that to an end user, they'll be happy. They'll say, give me more. What's next? And so the activity of scoping your roadmap around this idea of what's the minimum delightful experience, what's the follow-on kind of experiences, allows you to scope that project in a way that that you're minimizing the collateral damage of a failed experiment, right? By keeping it small, you're delivering something delicious, but also minimizing the damage, the collateral damage. If that cupcake maybe isn't the right piece, maybe the mix isn't quite perfect, but you've at least scoped something that you can deliver. Ideally, it has the value that your user expects, but it's small enough that if it's not, you can make another cupcake really quickly.
Or change the frosting, or add more sugar, or you can pivot quickly.
Yeah.
And what we've learned so back to the entrepreneurial world, right? So you, as an entrepreneur on a startup, you don't have time to build and sell the wedding cake. People don't even know if they want to get married yet, right? They don't even know if they want to date yet. So the idea of building cupcakes to help you. And so this what came up with this idea is this is how you come up with cupcakes, you go test them, and by doing this iteration of convergence, divergence, or divergence, convergence, divergence, convergence, right? We've converged on our cupcake. And now, if you go through this step, I would surmise that your odds of having good market fit have increased dramatically. And oh, by the way, it doesn't cost a lot to do this. In fact, in today's world, virtually, that's why the last picture on this slide is, Nicholas and I used to travel all over the world. We've been to Germany, we've been to London, I've been to South Africa, we've been to Hong Kong or Singapore doing these workshops and working with our clients through this process. And now we can do it all virtually. I mean, we had to because we were all, I haven't been on I traveled for business in over 18 months. So as we wrap this section up, the message is, by the way, we'll put a link or we'll give some capability if anybody's listening or watching wants this sort of 5-step process for market fit, better market fit. We're happy to share it. But that's sort of why I wanted to tie the experience that Nicholas has as a designer to the work that Jan and I are doing with entrepreneurs and startup. So that's that section.
And just to add to that, John, like when I think about what I would do if I was starting a business today, I figure out like what are 5 cupcakes that are kind of close to my wedding cake, that are kind of in the vein of my wedding cake, and find the cheapest way to figure out if people care about it. Like, and that would be, standard process, a standard kind of practice. Like with each business I would launch is like, what are my 5 cupcakes each month until I kind of ooch my way to product market fit.
Yep. And that actually goes into the next sort of thing I want to just pick your brain about. And I'm going to start with another story again, if you guys don't mind. But it's a term actually that you introduced to me to is the I don't know what the FANAFI, find a need and fill it. Now, I want to tie that back to a book that if every entrepreneur listening to this section hasn't read, it's called The Blue Ocean Strategy. And I want to give an example, and I want to try to show you how Nicholas and I have sort of taken the concept of working and selling in a blue ocean and how we've applied design thinking to sort of enhance that. So I'm going to share my screen one more time.
And while you're doing that, I'm just going to double click for everybody that's listening to this. Definitely go read that book. Like, if we're posting the video, you're going to see me doing the raise the roof motion. That book is phenomenal. And like, I'm getting my notebook out to take notes on this section specifically. So I'm super excited.
And by the way, these charts, well, obviously will be available in the video, but I'm happy to share them with others. So this actually sort of ties into what we just talked about, right? This idea of my capability as an entrepreneur or a startup. What do I do? What do I sell basically, or what does my product or service do? And then on the other line is this idea of the prospect's needs. And right in the last section, we talked about how we have high needs and high capability. We have a good market fit. But what really happens in the world today is our prospect needs are represented by these red dots, and our capability is on the other axis, right? And what happens is that's where so many people go in and sort of try to do this feature function selling, right? Here's your need, here's my capability, here's my need, here's your capability, right? So it's this idea of back and forth, back and forth. What I like to say is that's, if you, those of you that are my age and watched Lost in Space, it's like when the robot would go, danger, Will Robinson, danger, danger. You are now swimming in the red ocean. In other words, you are just in a feature function battle with 100 other companies and 100 other product or services, and you're just going to beat your head down on cost. And so what most salespeople do is they go, well, I'm going to upsell. I'm going to tell you about the value add. So they start talking about more capability that the client does, in theory hasn't said they need. Well, unfortunately, the prospect or the buyer perceives that as increased cost and complexity, which of course slows your deal down. That was the exact problem we had after we bought the company. We started talking about all the red dots and all the green dots, and all of a sudden the client's going, holy crap, this is going to be really expensive and it's going to take me forever to deploy and implement. So I would argue, so the question is, how do I get out of this red ocean and into the blue ocean? And so the concept is sort of basic, but sort of, and Nicholas, you actually alluded to it when we started up, which was sort of cool because we hadn't rehearsed this. It's how do you uncover the clients or the prospects' unconsidered needs, right? So it's how do you identify problems and needs the prospect does not even know they have, which is a classic example of being a disruptor, right? It's I'm Netflix, Uber is probably the greatest one. Whoever thought that you would want to, order a car service from a total stranger on an app, right? And you disrupt the taxi cab industry, right? So the taxi cabs were all fighting in this red ocean. And Uber came up and figured out there were a whole bunch of things that me as a rider didn't even know I needed. But once I realized it and they showed it to me, it opened up the blue ocean. So that in a nutshell is sort of the go ahead, Nicholas.
No, yeah, finish what you were saying, and then I wanted to double click on that when you
I'm
finish.
done.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'm done.
I love this. I think one of my favorite, product design case studies to kind of illustrate this is some of the work that OXO, they're a kitchen product company. They make good grips. I'm sure people are familiar with them. And what made that story so interesting is that they knew they had a target audience, right? They had a target segments that they're going after from a marketing standpoint, but from a product design standpoint what they said was, we're going to design for the end user that has the greatest impairment in using their hands. We're going to focus on senior citizens. We're going to focus on people with arthritis. And we're going to design our product to meet their needs. And so by picking that extreme user that's often not considered, right, and designing their product for them, they're able to satisfy the needs of their entire segment. So by starting kind of in the extreme on that edge, a group of people that's often ignored, our senior citizens and our senior community are often ignored when hipsters are making technology. There's this whole world of unmet need that, OXO tapped into and has been incredibly successful as a result. I mean, right now we have the iPhone, right? One question I ask myself is, I've observed my grandmother using your iPhone, and all she does to navigate is press the back button. She picks something, she goes down a tunnel, and then if it's the wrong tunnel, she just back, starts at the top, and then goes down again. And this is how her interaction behavior. But nobody's designing an interface that's going to support that behavior, right? Those interfaces aren't out there. No one's designing phones. No one's dividing devices for these people. No one's designing devices for children, right? We're just trying to find right now, if you look at the design of our technology, it's like those crazy, or it's like those remote controls that your cable company gives you with like 200 buttons. It's like there's all the features, and Apple came out and made like 2 buttons and 3 buttons, and it's really easy to use. But you
It's
don't
actually
get
one of my favorite examples is the cable company remote. And if you've bought a Roku TV and you look at the Roku remote, they designed it to fit the hand, the grip that you could. I mean, they did a lot of design, and there's like 6 buttons on it.
Yeah, but you don't get there until you start thinking about the users with unmet needs or the users that weren't considered. Those extremes, the fringe. I think one of my favorite books, it's by Chip and Dan Heath, called Decisive. They say there's like 4 horsemen of bad decision making, and one of them is narrow framing. That's one of the big ones, which is, I'm only looking at this tunnel. I haven't expanded the aperture and thought beyond kind of that red ocean into the fringes of the blue ocean and find that opportunity there.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm going to just double click on as far as process goes, I think we're going to this episode's coined phrase is going to be double click because we've all used it at this point. So we do a lot of research into Disney. When we first started Apex, and he has this interesting thing, like 4 levels of detail, right? And he would also force the Imagineers when they were coming up with ideas. It's like, you have to be able to distill this down to one sentence. If I don't care if it's a new door hinge or if it's a new ride for the park, one sentence as to why we need to do this, right? What is the value prop in that one sentence? And I find it interesting because some of the people that I talk to, at least in the area that I'm in. Now I'm finally expanding outside of the Midwest and meeting a bunch of different people. But when we first started, especially in COVID, what we were encountering when we were talking to all these people is a very anxious mindset when we started to take them into that first diverge. Right. It's like they get all of this influx of ideas and then they're like, oh my God, like I don't know what I'm going to do with all of this. But what I found fascinating is actually the more time you're able to be disciplined in that space where there's a lot of different ideas, the simpler the outcome becomes, and like John just made a great point with Roku. It's like the more time you spend in the quote unquote anxiety of the unknown, you end up with 6 buttons instead of 200. It's really, really easy to say, let's put all of the features on the remote. It is exponentially more difficult to figure out which 6 buttons, I'm going to cuss here, but which 6 buttons people actually give a shit about, right?
Yep. Yep. It's easy to put out the kitchen sink into the product. It's hard to prioritize. People don't like to prioritize. They're risk averse. They don't want to be the one that made the decision, you know? So there's a lot of reasons why people have difficulty picking those 6 buttons.
Dude, it's so important. So important.
Cool.
You know? And a lot of design is about reducing that complexity, right? It's a lot of design is removing stuff. Like we'll see these interfaces that are designed by engineers and we're like, lose that, lose that, lose that, lose that. Why do we need this? What's the user trying to do with this page? Okay, that's the priority. Let's remove all the fluff from this page and only focus on the key interaction that the user cares about in this context. And remove the noise, right?
Yeah. Okay, one last thing, and we'll let everybody get on to the rest of their day. I want to give you the last word, Nicholas, on something that you brought up with me, and I'm not sure I even understand it, so I'm sort of looking forward to it. And you had mentioned something about democratizing the creative process, and so it really caught my eye. I mean, we've had a few discussions on it, but I'd love you to just sort of expound on that for us.
Yeah, it actually dovetails really nicely what we were just talking about, right? Like people making decisions, right? How do those decisions get made? And for design thinking, right? For the longest time, going back to that kind of great person or great man theory of history, there's this visionary, this auteur, that has this mega opus vision, magnum opus vision, and we're all just kind of actors in his show and we're trying to help. When we democratize the creative process, it's very disruptive because it allows a lot more diversity into that creative process. So instead of just one person kind of having a vision for a software, it's the difference between making a product and $100 million art project, right? And an art project is a single visionary kind of directing, the Banksy model, where Banksy's the name, but there's 200 artists making his work, right? Versus an effort where you've democratized the creative process. You're bringing in your end users, you're bringing in different subject matter experts, you're bringing in a lot of different points of view to really vet that idea before you invest in developing it. So what design thinking really allows people to do is to collaborate in a structured way, bring a diverse point of view to those collaborative activities, and look at the problem through the same lens with that kind of difference that they bring. We might be different, but we're not separate. We might have different points of view, but we're not separate. And design thinking democratizes that creative process to allow those different points of view to work collectively and together in order to achieve an outcome, as opposed to a single individual identifying the hill and then executing against it, right? And when you have that diversity of voice in the room, you get better outcomes, you get better solutions, you get things that are more representative of the community that you wish to serve.
Well said. Cool. All right, Jan, I only have one last thing. If anybody liked what they saw today, I'm happy to share the Disruptors 5 steps the better market fit chart. And I've also prepared the Disruptors design thinking primer, which I'm happy to share. And we can work in the show notes or reach out directly with direct message to me on LinkedIn or Twitter or something. But hopefully you found this enjoyable. Nicholas, you and I could probably talk for another 2 hours. Jan, I'm going to let you have the last word. And
Like, want to buy chopped liver over here? I feel like I could hang
yeah,
out for 2 more
well,
hours.
yeah. Well, no, but Nicholas and I, I bring on people sometimes
You
I
guys
don't
go
know
way
real
back,
well.
way
Yeah.
back. Yeah.
So, but you know what? I always say, Jan, you're sort of my brother from a different mother because we sort of came from the same part of the world. But Nicholas and I are definitely like brothers from a different mother, and he has made me like probably whichever brain is the creative side. He has definitely got me trying to be more creative, and I think I'm helping him look at how to apply all these cool things he does and take it outside into the real world and talk to people that actually want to buy stuff. So I appreciate Jan, you having us on today, and it was been very good. Yeah, namaste, as we said to my last guest, who was anyway. So that's
Climb Mount
all I have.
Everest.
Yeah. So Jan, anything else you want to conclude as the host?
I just want to say how like appreciative I am of being able to be around these types of conversations, right? So I mean, like I kind of went off on that original tangent where I'm just like fascinated with the neurology and the biology behind what you're doing, right? And so making this transition and meeting John, John kind of put it lightly where he was like, I taught Giannis for empathy map. And the reasoning is because I was trying to come up with a physical business model that would not work. And he was like, this is not bueno. Let's take you down a different rabbit hole before you just waste a whole bunch of time or money developing something that is not going to fit the market, right? So that was my first lesson, like coming up on 2+ years ago now, and I've been obsessed with it ever since. So understanding that there are all of these minds, working on the intimate connection between psychology, sales, marketing, creating safe spaces, questions, games, all of these different things to get humans to interact better. I have this thing that I'll just kind of, leave at the end of the episode here, that we're going through a consciousness revolution right now. Like the human body, the human brain, that we've gone through these stages. If you like look at history, where we had the bubonic plague and then the Renaissance, and then we had the flu of 1918, and we had the Roaring Twenties, and now we've had COVID, and technology got introduced, and people are adopting technology. They're getting used to technology, and they're instantaneously communicating. And now there's a group of aspiring Renaissance men, I'll call us, that are looking at how do we advance humanity inside of this latest context. And I want to make sure that the guests that are listening really understand the gravity of the types of conversations like these that are going on. It's that this is not just, revolutionizing a process. This is humans communicating completely democratized at scale. We're seeing crazy crap happen in the stock market because of Reddit and 4chan and Twitter and all this instantaneous communication. We're seeing crazy stuff happen in innovation. To John's point, the speed of disruption has drastically increased over the last 30 years. And now we're trying to figure out how to slow people down again and get them to communicate with each other, and using all of these different triggers. So for anybody that's listening, if you're listening right now, you've made it all the way to the end, go back to the beginning 2 days from now and re-listen to the episode, because I guarantee there'll be things that you think of when you give your brain that chance to rest and process things that you'll pick up from the episode. Because I know I'm sitting here recording it, and I'm going to be excited while I'm post editing it to listen again and pick up on all of these ideas. So thank you both for allowing me to, kind of host the party, I guess, in a way, to so to speak.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cool. And for everybody that's listening, we'll make sure that we put stuff in the show notes and the descriptions. And like John said, for right now, the best way to try to get a hold of any of the, materials that were used on the podcast, probably just send me a direct message on LinkedIn, or go ahead and add John on LinkedIn. John, do you want to let them know how to spell your name so that they can type that in?
Sure. It's last name is Kund, like Delta, T like Tango, Z like Zulu. So
beautiful. And then I'm Jan Almasy. It's Jan. It looks like Jan, Jan. Almasy, Almasy. And then Nicholas, do you have a LinkedIn as well?
Yeah, it's I believe it's Nicholas Jayanty, Jayanty.
Beautiful. So if you guys want to know any more, go ahead and follow us on LinkedIn. And until next time, in another episode of The Disruptor. Have a great day, guys.